But the real consequences of his actions? They were only just beginning. The weight of the moment hung in the air, pressing down on the store owner like a heavy fog. He had spent years crafting his reputation, curating an image of exclusivity and refinement. But now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had unraveled. The woman stood before him not as the poor, unworthy customer he had dismissed, but as someone far beyond his grasp. He didn't know her name, but that card, the hushed gasps, and the stunned faces around him told him enough. His throat tightened. I didn't realize. The woman raised a hand, silencing him with effortless grace. You didn't care to realize. The store was completely still. The other customers, who had once watched with quiet curiosity, now stared with something closer to judgment. The assistant fidgeted at the counter, avoiding his boss's gaze. The suited man who had entered with urgency stood beside the woman like a silent force, his disapproval radiating through the room. The store owner swallowed hard. His mind raced for a way out, a way to undo what had been done. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot, he said, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. Why don't we start over? I'd be happy to. The woman turned, already heading for the door. The suited man followed without hesitation. The store owner's hands clenched at his sides. Wait, he blurted out, voice tinged with desperation. Please, let's talk. I didn't mean to offend you. She paused, but only for a second. Without looking back, she replied, You already did. And then, she was gone. The door shut behind her, leaving a vacuum of silence in her wake. The store owner let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. A new tension settled in as he noticed the customers still watching him, their expressions unreadable but heavy with quiet judgment. Someone murmured, That's going viral for sure. His stomach turned. His gaze darted to the woman who had recorded the encounter on her phone. She gave him a look, one of pity, perhaps, but also finality before slipping out the door as well. The store owner spun toward his assistant. Do you know who she is? He demanded, his voice sharp, cracking at the edges. The assistant hesitated before nodding. I think so, he admitted. And if I'm right, then you just made a huge mistake. A chill ran down the owner's spine. For the rest of the day, the store felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, and though customers still came and went, the energy had shifted. A few whispered as they browsed. Some left without purchasing anything at all. By nightfall, the weight of the encounter pressed down on him like an unbearable force. He checked his phone compulsively, scrolling through social media, searching for any sign that the moment had slipped away unnoticed. But there it was, video clips, blurry yet damning, shared again and again. The comments flooded in. Typical. Some people only respect money when they can see it. Imagine turning away someone like that. He just ruined his own business. Kindness costs nothing, but now? He's going to pay a heavy price. He swallowed hard. The backlash had begun. By the next morning, things had only worsened. Calls came in, some from loyal customers demanding answers, others from media outlets hungry for a statement. His email inbox was flooded with messages, some from angry patrons vowing never to return, others from journalists requesting interviews. And then, the real blow came. A notification popped up, an article from a major news outlet. Luxury boutique owner refuses to serve woman, regrets it immediately. His breath hitched as he read the first few lines. The woman's identity had been revealed. She wasn't just a wealthy shopper, she was a philanthropist, a business mogul, a figure known for her quiet but immense influence. Someone who had built her fortune from the ground up, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others. The businessman, still amused by his own arrogance, barely acknowledged the janitor as he strolled through the lobby of his high-rise office building. Every night, without fail, the man would be there pushing his mop, wiping down desks, emptying trash cans. To the businessman, he was invisible, just another nameless worker in the background of his life. But something strange began to happen. He started noticing the janitor in ways he hadn't before. The man never rushed through his tasks like most others did, never looked exhausted or resentful of his work. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, moving deliberately, as if he were performing a task far greater than simply cleaning floors. And then there were the whispers, the hushed conversations between employees who spoke about the janitor with an odd mixture of curiosity and reverence. One night, as the businessman was leaving late from a board meeting, he overheard two security guards talking near the elevators. "I swear, the guy knows more about business than half the execs in this building," one of them said. "No kidding," the other replied. "I asked him for advice on investing, and the next thing I know, I doubled my savings." The businessman frowned. Advice on investing? From a janitor? It was absurd. And yet, something about the way they spoke almost gnawed at him. Days passed, and the businessman's curiosity deepened. He started observing the janitor more closely, noting the way employees would stop to chat with him, not out of politeness, but out of genuine respect. Some even took notes when he spoke, nodding as if he were saying something profound. One evening, unable to resist any longer, the businessman decided to approach the janitor himself. As he stepped forward, he made sure to keep his tone light, almost mocking. "So, I hear you're the office's secret financial guru," he said with a smirk. "Should I be worried about you taking my job?" The janitor looked up, his expression unreadable. He wiped his hands on his uniform and met the businessman's gaze, unshaken by the clear condescension in his voice. "That depends," he said evenly. "Do you think you could learn something from a janitor?" The businessman chuckled. "Doubtful," he said. "But I'm willing to humor you. What's your secret? Stock tips? Cryptocurrency? Insider knowledge?" The janitor simply shook his head. "Nothing that complicated," he said. "Just an understanding of value, the kind most people overlook." The businessman scoffed. "And where did you learn that? Mopping floors?" A flicker of amusement crossed the janitor's face, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, well-worn notebook. He flipped through the pages, stopping at one filled with neat, handwritten notes. "I used to own a company," the janitor said casually, as if discussing the weather. "A pretty successful one." The businessman's smirk faltered. "What?" The janitor nodded. "Built it from the ground up. Sold it for a good sum. But money? Well, money doesn't mean much if you don't know how to use it." The businessman narrowed his eyes, unsure if he was being played. "If you were so successful, what are you doing here?" The janitor closed his notebook and tucked it back into his pocket. "Maybe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said. The businessman didn't know how to respond. He had spent his whole life chasing wealth, climbing the corporate ladder, proving his worth through power and possessions. But here was a man who had seemingly walked away from all of it, and yet, he didn't seem bitter or broken. He seemed content. That night, the businessman couldn't sleep. He searched online, digging through company records, scanning through news articles. And then, he found it. The janitor's real story. He wasn't just any former businessman, he was once a mogul, a name that had graced financial magazines, a man who had built an empire and then, mysteriously, disappeared from the public eye. But why? And more importantly, what had he learned that made him walk away from everything? The businessman had to know. But what he didn't realize was that the truth would shake the very foundation of everything he believed in. The businessman stared at his screen, unable to tear his eyes away from the articles in front of him. Page after page detailed the janitor's past, his rise from nothing, his groundbreaking business ventures, his company's meteoric success. And then, just as suddenly, he had disappeared. Sold everything. Walked away. There were speculations, scandals, betrayals, even rumors that he had lost his fortune in some disastrous investment, but none of them explained why a man who had once been at the top of the world was now pushing a mop in the very type of building he used to own. The next day, the businessman arrived at work with one goal in mind: answers. He waited until most employees had left for the evening before finding the janitor in a quiet hallway, carefully polishing a brass railing. "You used to be a billionaire," the businessman said without preamble. The janitor didn't look up. "Money doesn't last," he said simply. "But it did for you," the businessman shot back. "Until you gave it up." The janitor sighed, placing his rag down and finally meeting the businessman's gaze. "Why does it bother you so much?" "Because it doesn't make sense," the businessman admitted. "People spend their whole lives trying to get what you had. And you just walked away?" For the first time, the janitor's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Let's take a walk," he said. Without waiting for a response, he started down the hall. The businessman hesitated for only a moment before following. They walked in silence for a while, passing empty offices and dimly lit hallways. Eventually, they stepped outside into the crisp night air. The city stretched out before them, bright, alive, endless. The businessman had always loved this view. It reminded him of what he was working toward, what he had sacrificed for. The janitor leaned against the railing, gazing out at the skyline. "I had everything they tell you to want," he said quietly. "The houses. The cars. The power. And for a while, I thought it made me happy." He turned slightly, looking at the businessman. "But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what's the price?" The businessman frowned. "The price of success?" "The price of believing that success is the only thing that matters," the janitor corrected. The businessman opened his mouth to respond, but the janitor wasn't finished. "I lost my family," he continued. "Not all at once, not in some dramatic moment. But piece by piece. My wife and I started as partners. We built everything together. But the more I chased after the next big thing, the more I left her behind. I missed anniversaries, birthdays. Our conversations became shorter, then non-existent." He exhaled slowly. "By the time I realized what I had done, she had already moved on from the business, from me. And my son, he stopped seeing me as his father. I was just the man who paid for things." The businessman swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "I told myself it was fine," the janitor continued. "That I could fix it later, that once I made enough, I'd finally have time for them. But the thing about time is once it's gone, you don't get it back." The businessman felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had heard stories like this before, cautionary tales about prioritizing wealth over family, but they had always seemed distant, abstract. This felt different. It felt real. "So you gave it all up?" the businessman asked, his voice quieter now. "I had nothing left to keep it for," the janitor said. "And I realized I didn't want it anymore." "But why become a janitor?" A small smile played at the corner of the janitor's lips. "Because I wanted to start over. Do something simple. Something honest." He gestured around them. "This building? It used to be mine. I remember standing in a boardroom just like yours, looking down on people like me, thinking I had all the answers." His smile faded. "I didn't." The businessman stared at him, unsure of what to say. He had spent his entire life chasing after the dream the janitor had willingly left behind. And now, for the first time, he was wondering if he was running toward something or away from something else. "You're still young," the janitor said after a moment. "You still have time to decide what kind of life you want. Just make sure it's one you won't regret." The businessman went home that night feeling unsettled. He lay awake for hours, thinking about his own life, the missed calls from his parents he never returned, the way his friends had slowly faded from his life, how he hadn't taken a real vacation in years. He thought about the way he measured success, about the numbers in his bank account, the cars in his garage. And for the first time, he wondered if any of it actually meant anything. The next day, he did something he never thought he would. He left work early. He went to see his parents. Had dinner with an old friend. Sat in his apartment without checking his emails, without worrying about what deal he might be missing. And the strangest thing happened. For the first time in years, he felt free. Weeks passed. He still worked, still chased success, but differently. He made time for people. He listened more. He learned that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about time, about relationships, about the moments that truly mattered. One evening, as he was leaving the office, he saw the janitor wiping down a desk. "You were right," the businessman said. The janitor looked up. "About what?" "That I could learn something from a janitor." The janitor chuckled. "I told you so." And with that, he picked up his mop and continued his work, content, fulfilled, at peace. The businessman walked away with a new understanding. Of success. Of value. Of life itself. And he knew he would never see the world the same way again.